Rich Tarani with TMC. Thanks for watching. We're in Boston this week, and we're talking to a number of really interesting companies. Right now, we've got Bill Lettingham. He's with Black Duck Software. And Bill, welcome to the program.
How are you? Thanks, Rich. Pleasure to be here.
So I'd love for you to give us the intro about your company and what you guys are doing.
Okay, Black Duck Software is all about managing open source software for organizations, the customers that we work with. We help them understand what open source software is in use within their organization, and then how to manage the associated potential risks around the use of open source, whether it's license risk, security risk, or operational risk. So we help them really understand what they have out there within their code base and how to manage it more effectively.
Great. So so first question is, how long have you been doing this?
So the company's been in business for a little over 10 years now. So over the course of time, we really started initially focused on technology companies, help them understand kind of the license risk associated with adopting open source into some of their products and technologies. It's now, with the adoption of open source across a number of different industries, we're really seeing much more adoption, everything from financial services to government organizations. Any company or organization is really looking to manage their use of open source more effectively.
And what's the risk of not managing it effectively?
You could potentially be exposing your technology or your intellectual property in terms of license agreements associated with open source. There are certain obligations based on the type of license. If it's a GPL license, for example, any technology that you add to that open source stack, you're obligated to give it back to the open source community. So that was really kind of the initial concern that a lot of companies had as they were adopting open source. From there, it's really branched out into other areas as open source has become much more pervasive. Now, other areas are more of a concern, such as security vulnerabilities, or choosing the right project in terms of one that's going to be well supported by the open source community, making sure that there's enough contributors out there and it's a viable ongoing open source project.
Now, can you give some examples of companies or situations where there were problems because they didn't adequately do due diligence in terms of what software they used?
So some good examples of the past year were just around some of the security vulnerabilities that came to light. For example, you may have heard of Heartbleed or Shell Shock. These are vulnerabilities that are associated with specific open source technology that was in use at a number of different corporations. So, for example, Heartbleed involved a vulnerability in the OpenSSL open source project. OpenSSL was used in a number of web applications, ranging from financial services companies to technology companies. Really across the board, it was widespread use. So the challenge that a lot of companies had when this vulnerability came to light, the first question that was raised by the CEO and the exec staff, are we exposed to this? And how bad is the exposure, and what do we need to do to mitigate it? So really our company helps the organizations that we work with answer those questions. Because we're maintaining a catalog of all the open source they have in use across all their different applications, all their different products, we can immediately address that question when a new vulnerability comes to light in a particular component. Are they using it, that specific version? If so, where, in what applications, and then what do we need to do to help them remediate it?
So if I could summarize, based on the understanding I have so far, your company helps your customers deal with open source software, specifically security and liability. Is there, right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, security, license, risk, operational risk.
So license, operational risk. Okay,
Yeah,
so
we kind of term it as open source software logistics. As you look at how companies are using more and more open source software today, the process by which they choose the particular open source project, how they scan their software code base, how they approve the use of different open source components, and how they really manage and deliver products with open source software embedded, we help them through that whole process.
So for a company looking to choose Black Duck software compared to a competitive solution, what is the reason they'll typically go with your company?
Really, it's because our solution is the most comprehensive one out there in the market. We maintain a knowledge base of all the open source projects that are out there on the web. Within that knowledge base today, we're tracking over 1 million different open source projects. Along with that knowledge base, we have all the information on vulnerabilities attached to those open source projects. We understand the licenses, the obligations. We have a view into how well supported is the community around each of those open source projects. So it's really that wealth of information that we can bring to bear to help them through that process of how they select components up front and then how they manage it through the life cycle.
Is there any news that we should know about that's recent?
No, we're just continuing to innovate in terms of our products and technologies. We just introduced a new version of our Code Center product yesterday that added additional capabilities to help customers understand and manage vulnerabilities within open source software.
Okay. Have we covered everything? Is there anything else we should know?
No, just in terms of kind of some things we have coming up in the future. We're in the process of kicking off our next version of our annual open source software survey. We do that, have been doing it for the past 8 years. We survey a couple thousand different organizations on their use of open source, and through that we're able to really see some of the key trends that are out there in terms of open source adoption, what are some of the hot projects, how open source is really pervading a lot of key technology areas, everything from big data and analytics today, web infrastructure, mobile applications, and IoT, or the Internet of Things, is another area where we're seeing a lot of adoption of open source technology.
Very exciting. Thanks for being on the program.
Well, thanks very much, Rich. I appreciate the opportunity and pleasure being here.